internally, within me, I felt like everything was going great. Somehow the songs that I would imagine.
Tonight, we bring you a revelation that remained hidden for over 4 decades. Music legend John Fogerty has come forward with a secret, one he's kept buried since 1983. A single phone call, one missed opportunity, and a tragic loss that would follow just 2 years later. At the center of it all, Ricky Nelson, the beloved teen idol turned serious artist who reached out to Fogerty with a heartfelt offer. An offer for a musical rebirth, a comeback album that could have changed both their lives. Fogerty said no, and then Nelson was gone. What followed was years of silence, personal demons, and the burden of what if. But now, at the age of 80, John Fogerty has broken his silence, not to glorify the past, but to finally tell a story that's haunted him since that phone rang. This is more than music history. It's a story of regret, artistic integrity, and the emotional price of saying no. In 1983, Ricky Nelson was at a crossroads. After years of being boxed in by his early image, the clean-cut heartthrob from television, Nelson was determined to reshape his legacy. He was no longer chasing the charts. What he wanted now was a body of work that reflected who he really was, an artist with depth, experience, and a sound all his own. To make that vision a reality, he reached out to someone he respected deeply, someone who, like him, had once stood at the center of American rock. That man was John Fogerty. Fogerty, however, was in a far different place. Still reeling from the implosion of Creedence Clearwater Revival and a brutal legal battle that had stripped him of his musical rights, Fogerty was slipping into isolation. Depression and alcoholism had taken their toll, and he had all but disappeared from the public eye. So when Nelson proposed they make a record together, an album that could redefine both their careers, Fogerty declined. No hesitation, no excuses, just a flat and quiet no. There was no argument, no follow-up, and Ricky Nelson never asked again. At the time, it seemed like just another missed connection in the music world. But less than 2 years later, on New Year's Eve of 1985, Nelson's life was cut short in a plane crash. And that short phone call, forgotten by the public, became, for John Fogerty, a defining moment of personal regret. He wouldn't speak about it for more than 30 years. In the years following his departure from Creedence Clearwater Revival, John Fogerty vanished from the spotlight. The band that had once dominated the charts imploded under pressure, legal disputes, and betrayal. And the aftermath left Fogerty devastated, not just professionally, but personally. Locked in a legal nightmare with Fantasy Records, Fogerty watched helplessly as the rights to his own songs slipped away. The very music he had written, sung, and made famous now legally belonged to someone else. It was more than a financial blow, it was a spiritual fracture. The court battles dragged on, his creative voice fell silent. He stopped touring, stopped recording. Reporters and fans noticed his absence, but few knew the extent of his unraveling. Privately, Fogerty battled depression. Alcohol became his shield. And while the music world moved on, he stayed quiet, swallowed by guilt, bitterness, and the belief that he had nothing left to give. So when Ricky Nelson called with his proposal, Fogerty didn't just say no because he wasn't interested. He said no because he felt broken. In his memoir, Fortunate Son, Fogerty later wrote, "I knew that if I said yes, I wouldn't do well. I didn't want to drag Ricky into a process that would fail." He believed Nelson would understand. What he didn't realize was that he'd never get the chance to explain. In the years following his departure from Creedence Clearwater Revival, John Fogerty vanished from the spotlight. The band that had once dominated the charts imploded under pressure, legal disputes, and betrayal. And the aftermath left Fogerty devastated, not just professionally, but personally. Locked in a legal nightmare with Fantasy Records, Fogerty watched helplessly as the rights to his own songs slipped away. The very music he had written, sung, and made famous now legally belonged to someone else. It was more than a financial blow, it was a spiritual fracture. The court battles dragged on. His creative voice fell silent. He stopped touring, stopped recording. Reporters and fans noticed his absence, but few knew the extent of his unraveling. Privately, Fogerty battled depression. Alcohol became his shield. And while the music world moved on, he stayed quiet, swallowed by guilt, bitterness, and the belief that he had nothing left to give. So when Ricky Nelson called with his proposal, Fogerty didn't just say no because he wasn't interested, he said no because he felt broken. In his memoir, Fortunate Son, Fogerty later wrote, "I knew that if I said yes, I wouldn't do well. I didn't want to drag Ricky into a process that would fail." He believed Nelson would understand. What he didn't realize was that he'd never get the chance to explain. Though they never recorded a single song together, the connection between Ricky Nelson and John Fogerty runs deeper than most fans ever realized. Long before Fogerty rose to fame with Creedence Clearwater Revival, he was just a teenager with a guitar, listening to the radio and listening closely to Ricky Nelson. But it wasn't Nelson's clean image or chart-topping voice that captivated him. It was the band behind him, specifically guitarist James Burton. Burton's precise, innovative picking style left a permanent impression on the young Fogerty. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, but what he played had structure, it had soul. Fogerty later called Burton a living guitar academy, and it wasn't just flattery. He adopted Burton's hybrid picking technique, a blend of picking and finger picking, and built it into the DNA of CCR hits like Green River and Midnight Special. But the influence didn't stop with technique. Fogerty was paying attention to something else, how Nelson carried himself as a performer. In an era of commercial pressure and manufactured stardom, Nelson delivered songs with restraint and integrity. He didn't need to scream rebellion. His rebellion was in his refusal to be shaped by others. That Fogerty understood instinctively. So when he was crafting CCR's sound, stripped down, bluesy, and unapologetically raw, he was echoing something Nelson had already proven, that music could be bold without being loud, and true without needing approval. The irony? Most people never noticed that the fire behind Creedence had its spark in a quiet teen idol who played with quiet conviction. While their careers took different paths, Ricky Nelson and John Fogerty shared something far more profound than musical influence. They both waged a quiet war against the very system that made them famous. Ricky Nelson had grown up in front of America, a teenager molded by the demands of television fame. But as he matured, so did his music. He moved toward country rock, a less commercial, more personal direction that defied audience expectations. The response? Indifference, resistance, at times even open rejection. When Nelson played new material at Madison Square Garden in 1971, the crowd didn't boo, they just stared blankly, waiting for the old hits. That silence, Nelson later wrote, spoke louder than any heckle. He left the stage and penned Garden Party, a song that quietly condemned the demand to keep reliving the past. John Fogerty's battle followed a similar trajectory. After CCR's breakup, Fogerty pushed forward with a solo career, one marked by deeply personal songs, darker lyrics, and raw emotion. But audiences weren't ready. They didn't want the man he'd become. They wanted the voice of Proud Mary, the voice of 1969. The pressure to conform was immense. At times, Fogerty refused to perform his old hits altogether, not out of disdain, but because he didn't want to be trapped by his own legacy. And just like Nelson, he chose silence over compromise. Both men stood at the top of their industry, and both paid a price for trying to evolve. In separate decades, under different spotlights, Ricky Nelson and John Fogerty fought the same battle, the struggle to grow while the world demanded they stay the same. In 2009, John Fogerty made a decision that surprised many longtime fans. On his album The Blue Ridge Rangers Rides Again, he chose to cover Garden Party, Ricky Nelson's most personal and pointed song. It wasn't a commercial move. It wasn't even a tribute in the traditional sense. For Fogerty, it was something much deeper. Garden Party had been written by Nelson after that now infamous concert at Madison Square Garden. He'd taken the stage with new songs, only to face an audience frozen in nostalgia, unwilling to hear anything unfamiliar. Nelson left the stage in quiet humiliation and later distilled the entire experience into a line that still echoes decades later. "If I can't be myself, there's no point in being there." Fogerty understood that feeling intimately. After Creedence broke up, he too had stood before crowds who didn't want to hear what he had become. They wanted a greatest hits machine, not a man writing new chapters. In covering Garden Party, Fogerty wasn't just performing someone else's song, he was inhabiting it. He kept the structure intact, the melody, the tempo, all preserved. The only change? His voice. Slower, heavier, wiser. It wasn't a recreation, it was a mirror. And he didn't do it alone. Don Henley and Timothy B. Schmidt of the Eagles joined him on background vocals. All three had lived through the weight of expectation. All three had felt the sting of being told to stay the same. The song didn't chart, it wasn't built to, but in the music world, it sent a quiet ripple, a nod to Nelson and to every artist who's ever tried to outgrow their image. Fogerty rarely performs Garden Party live, and when he does, there are no introductions, no backstory, no mention of Madison Square Garden. He just sings it and lets the silence around it say the rest. They never recorded together. They never stood in a studio at the same time. And yet, John Fogerty and Ricky Nelson shared a bond that most collaborators never reach, one forged not through performance, but through parallel pain. Fogerty has rarely spoken about Nelson over the years, but when he does, his words are deliberate, precise, and anchored in memory. He doesn't just recall songs, he recalls moments, guitar riffs, rhythms, emotional textures, not as a fan, but as a peer. Nelson, in his silence, mirrored Fogerty's own instincts. Both men kept their struggles largely private. They avoided controversy. They rarely explained themselves. Instead, they let their music speak. And when the world misunderstood them, they stepped back, not because they were defeated, but because they refused to be reshaped by expectation. In a 2025 interview, Fogerty admitted that the reason he never shared the story of Nelson's offer wasn't to protect himself. It was because, in his words, "I wasn't worthy to tell it." He believed he hadn't earned the right, not until he was older, not until he had reclaimed his voice, and not until the weight of silence became heavier than the words themselves. That rare kind of restraint, the choice to speak only when it truly matters, defines both men. And so the connection between Nelson and Fogerty lives not in a song they made, but in a legacy they quietly built on opposite sides of the same struggle. One that continues to resonate in every understated lyric, in every missed collaboration, and in the sound of two artists who understood each other without ever needing to say much at all. After decades of legal battles and silence, John Fogerty finally reclaimed the rights to his music in 2023, a victory more than 50 years in the making. But instead of seizing the moment to reassert his solo identity or revisit old glory, he chose something far more personal. He stepped back onto the stage, this time with his sons Shane and Tyler by his side. The image was striking, not just a rock legend returning to his roots, but a father sharing his legacy. The trio didn't just perform Creedence classics, they carried forward the essence of an era, blending generational passion with seasoned restraint. And for Fogerty, it wasn't just about the music, it was about transmitting values, resilience, authenticity, and the courage to stay true to your voice. It's a story that mirrors Ricky Nelson's own journey. As a child star, Nelson had once performed with his parents on The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, America's most wholesome television family. Years later, he brought his own children into the fold, touring with them as he tried to evolve his sound and break free from his earlier image. Fogerty later reflected on that. He said that watching Nelson perform with his family had stayed with him for decades, not just as a stage dynamic, but as a symbol of continuity, of honoring the past without being chained to it. In that decision to play alongside his children, Fogerty wasn't just reviving old music, he was modeling a way forward, a way to keep integrity alive across generations. The songs may be the same, the faces may be new, but the message is timeless. Stay grounded, don't chase the market, and never surrender the sound that made you who you are. It's a principle not often celebrated in the world of popular music, but for both Nelson and Fogerty, it was and remains the only way to play. This isn't the story of a tribute performance. It's not even about legacy in the way we usually define it. What John Fogerty revealed decades after Ricky Nelson's death wasn't a gesture of praise. It was a confession, a burden laid bare. At 80, Fogerty no longer seeks the spotlight. He has nothing left to prove. Creedence Clearwater Revival is firmly etched into American music history. The rights to his songs are finally back in his hands. And yet, in recounting his journey, he made room for someone else, a figure whose name isn't always shouted, but whose influence has never faded. Ricky Nelson. Fogerty didn't dramatize the missed opportunity. He didn't mourn the absence of a hit album or speculate about what might have been. Instead, he acknowledged a silent, shared suffering. Two men who rose fast, who faced enormous expectations, who stood still while the world demanded repetition, and who ultimately chose dignity over applause. Nelson died too young to reposition himself. Fogerty lived long enough to understand what they both endured and long enough to speak for them both. In recent performances, when Fogerty sings Garden Party, he doesn't introduce the song, he doesn't explain, he lets the lyrics breathe, and whatever the audience hears is up to them. Some recognize the history, others just feel the weight of it. And that's enough. Because sometimes music isn't meant to be dissected or sold. Sometimes it's just meant to be played quietly, honestly, for those still listening. Fogerty once said that when he covered Garden Party, it didn't need a crescendo or a spotlight, it just needed the right mood. Now that mood has arrived, and so has the story, not just of two artists, but of two lives shaped by silence, integrity, and an unwavering refusal to let the world define them. When John Fogerty finally told the story, the one he'd carried in silence for over 40 years, it wasn't framed in heroism. It wasn't romanticized. It was personal, quiet, and long overdue. He wasn't elevating Ricky Nelson to legendary status. He wasn't rewriting history. He was simply acknowledging a man who, like himself, spent much of his life misunderstood. For Nelson, it was the weight of an image he couldn't escape. For Fogerty, it was the shadow of a past he didn't choose to live in. Both were judged not for who they became, but for what they once were, and what people wanted them to stay. Their shared silence wasn't weakness, it was a kind of defiance. In an industry built on reinvention, both artists held their ground, even when it cost them everything. So when Fogerty finally spoke, it wasn't just for himself. It was for every artist who's ever been told to sing someone else's song. For every creative mind asked to repeat the past instead of create the future. And for every listener who's willing to look beyond nostalgia and actually hear what's being said. Because sometimes what matters most isn't the song that gets played, but the one that never had the chance. And now, that story has been told. If you've made it this far, maybe something in this story stayed with you. Maybe you remember the first time you heard Proud Mary, or maybe Garden Party played in the background of your childhood. Or maybe you're just hearing this story now and realizing that some of the most powerful music ever made came from artists who weren't trying to impress us, but just trying to be heard. John Fogerty didn't share this story to reopen old wounds. He did it because Ricky Nelson can't speak anymore. And when one artist recognizes another, especially after years of silence, it becomes more than a tribute. It becomes a responsibility. That's why stories like this matter, not because they're dramatic, but because they remind us what's behind the music: fear, doubt, courage, and sometimes quiet regret. So if this story meant something to you, if it gave you a new perspective, a memory, or even just a moment of pause, let us know. Leave a comment, share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe more people should remember Ricky Nelson for who he really was, not just for the image, but for the music, then help us keep the conversation going. Because some stories only get told when we're still listening.